Let me tell you a little bit about the tour. So this is the Liberate Your Mind tour. We did this last year, and I think the only people we saw last year were Mike, so it's cool to talk to new faces and new folks and friends. We are sponsored by Bitcoin.com for this tour, and what that means is I can't afford to travel around the country and visit 58 cities out of my own pocket, so they pay the bill because we have a mutual exchange. They believe in alternative economic exchange, disrupting the Federal Reserve and disrupting the central banking system. I'm a freelance independent journalist activist who also believes in disrupting the economic system and a lot of other systems that we're going to talk about tonight. So it's a mutual benefit. So when I say we're sponsored by Bitcoin.com, all that means is they're paying our gas, our food, etc., etc. And in exchange for that, we put up this banner, we give out some free information, and we help introduce people to cryptocurrency. And I think most of this crowd probably understands how crypto can be very helpful. And that's kind of its own conversation, but just so you guys are aware of why this giant banner is next to me. And as I said earlier, for those who are interested, while I'm talking, if you go to your app store and you just search Bitcoin.com, you can download the Bitcoin.com app, and we are giving away free Bitcoin Cash. So at the end of this talk, for those who want to participate in that, we'll do that all together. And I'll give you guys all $2 in Bitcoin Cash, and you can see how the transaction works. Hopefully it'll go up, and your $2 will turn into $2 million will help, right?
Okay, maybe I'll stay.
Well, if you want to walk before that, she can help you get signed up with the wall.
Yeah,
if you got to
okay.
before that. But yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing. Last year, this tour was called the Decentralize Your Life Tour. We did 45 cities. This year is the Liberate Your Mind Tour. We're doing 58 cities. So we changed the name up to the amount of cities. We did more time on the road. It'll be 58 cities, 18,000 miles, 90 days on the road total. We've already spent 2 weeks traveling across Texas. We did 3 weeks across the Midwest and went home for a couple of weeks, and now we just left Houston on Friday. So this is just day 5 on the road, the third day of events for us. We'll be on the road for the next 4 weeks, going all through the whole West Coast, then coming back down. Is anybody here going to be at Jackalope? Jackalope Freedom Fest? Anybody going to be at Jackalope? Cool. Well, if not, look up Jackalope. Once we go up to the Northwest and make our way back down, we'll be headed to Jackalope and spending 5 days there. So if you want to catch up with us then, we're really excited about that. And yeah, so last year, the reason it was called the Decentralize Your Life Tour, I was talking about decentralization of economic systems. So we're talking about crypto, we're talking about barter systems, we're talking about getting out of the mainstream economic system, the Federal Reserve System, all that. We were talking about unplugging from the unsustainable food production system, talking about permaculture, talking about local food production, community gardens, urban farms, things of that sort. Talking about unplugging from the corporate media, supporting independent media, becoming the media ourselves. Talking about unplugging and decentralizing from the education system. All these different areas, how can we decentralize, opt out of those? That's what our focus was last year. And that's a part of what we're talking about tonight as well. But as I started to prepare for this year's tour, I was thinking, what can I do differently, right? I don't want to just travel the country saying the same exact things, doing the same thing. I'd like to bring some new information. And when the Liberate Your Mind tour came to me, I started to think, what does it really mean to be liberated, right? What does it mean to be liberated mentally, physically, spiritually? And how can we talk about that? How can I travel and share knowledge with people to help them become more liberated so that those solutions that we talk about, the decentralized solutions, actually apply and make sense, right? So I like to define terms, so we're going to define what does liberate mean, what does mind mean. We're going to get into all that. And tonight, this presentation is something brand new that I put together just for this tour. There have been a few people who have filmed it, but so far we haven't had anybody release it yet, which is kind of what I'm hoping for, because this is brand new. This is something that I'll be doing over the next year. This is sort of the culmination of my 10 years as an activist, as a journalist, and as a researcher. For those who are unaware, well, first off, my name is Derrick Broze, and I run the Conscious Resistance website, and I write for several different independent media websites, and I've been doing that for about 8-9 years now, full-time as an activist, full-time speaking, and just living this, not just kind of being the weekend hobby activist. There's nothing wrong with that, but for me it's become like, this is all I do, right? This is not kind of a weekend hobby or something I'm doing in my free time. This is all I do, is try to empower myself, better myself, and encourage others to do the same. And of course, it's a constant struggle, and it's all about balance, right? But I wanted to really think, like when I started to put this tour together, I was like, what can I say that's different, right? I've spent 8-9 years talking about solutions. Anybody who's followed my work knows that I've always focused on solutions, specifically agorism, counter-economics, opting out of the state, trying to recognize the problems we see with corporate entities, with governmental entities, and saying, okay, well, let's stop playing their game. Let's not vote them out. Let's not violently overthrow them. Let's just build something better, right? Let's take our physical, mental, spiritual, economic energy away from them and redirect it elsewhere so we can build new systems. So I've almost exclusively focused on solutions for the last 9 years. And as I was putting this together, I realized, I've never done a sort of full spectrum documentary or article or anything that really lays out everything that I've found in my research of the last 10 years, like how, what is this thing that we're dealing with? And I thought, well, maybe that might be a good time for this tour to do that. Not only because the information is important, and I think people need to know what we're about to go over, but also I really think that if you don't understand how fucked up our world is, and excuse my language, but I'm just being brutally honest here, I think we can all handle it, and don't understand how corrupt things are, and don't understand the true depths of the situation that we're dealing with, then perhaps the solutions don't really seem that necessary, right? So for example, if you don't understand that we currently have a system that allows people from institutions like Monsanto and others to have this revolving door relationship with government, where our food is just completely corrupted, where they're poisoning the food and doing things like that. When I tell you, you need to start growing your own food, or at least go volunteer at a community garden, or at least go support the farmers markets, you might be like, yeah, that kind of sounds cool, but you just brush it off because it doesn't seem that important. Unless you understand how important that is, because specifically with food, growing your own food is one of the biggest steps towards independence. So I started to think that maybe it's important for me to pause for a moment on just talking about the solutions, spend a little time talking about the negative things, the bad things, right? So we can really understand that, and then by the end of this talk, we're going to bring it full circle and we'll talk about the solutions again. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go through what I am calling the pyramid of power. We're going to describe this pyramid and all the different institutions that I think are responsible for a lot of the injustices and crimes that we see in our world. And then we're also going to take a moment to acknowledge that we each as individuals help them do what they do. That we are all playing a role in this as well, because we support systems, whether consciously or unconsciously, that allow a lot of the injustices to happen in the world. And that means that's governmental and otherwise. So we're going to talk about that. Personal responsibility is, of course, important. We can't just point our fingers outward and blame everybody else for our problems, right? We also have to point our fingers back in and say, well, am I still using their money? Am I still supporting them? Am I still buying their food? Am I still watching their news? Am I, and look at these systems and ask if we're truly, if we're truly free from them, or if we're supporting them and allowing them to continue. All right, so let's define these terms. When I'm talking about liberation, the word liberate, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means to set someone free from a situation, especially imprisonment or slavery, in which their liberty is severely restricted. It also means to release someone from a state or situation that limits their freedom of thought or behavior. So imprisonment or slavery in which they're severely restricted, limitations on freedom of thought and behavior. Mind, that term is defined as the element of a person that enables them to be aware of the world. So your awareness, your consciousness, your feelings, your intellect, your thought, a person's attention, memory, or intellect, right? So when you put that together to liberate your mind, right? This means to set someone's consciousness, their awareness, their thoughts, their intellect free from restriction, slavery, imprisonment, limitations on their freedom of thought and behavior, right? So that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about liberating your mind, we want to set our awareness, our consciousness, our literal, entire being free from the situations and individuals and institutions that want to either imprison us or inhibit our freedom of thought and behavior, okay? So unfortunately, in the world we live in, there are quite a few people who would like to limit our freedom and would like to stand in the way of us being truly liberated beings. And as I said, I think in order for us to really understand the solutions, we must know the problem. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So if it starts getting heavy in here for a minute, please do excuse me. I hope it's not too heavy, but it's informative, because I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that this presentation for me is not about fear-mongering. It's not about trying to Alex Jones you out for the night and have you go home buying iodine and whatnot. I mean, you probably should get some in case, but you know what I mean? It's more about awareness, okay? So this is take the awareness and take the information and then use it as fuel to learn more and to do something. And not just holy shit, the world's pretty screwed up. What am I going to do about it? Well, we're going to find out what we can do about it. So as I said, we're describing what I call a pyramid of power. And typically pyramids, I think the reason they're associated with power and authority is, what comes to mind when you think of pyramids? Like Egypt, pharaohs, right? That's where the pharaohs supposedly rested, right? Or think of a pyramid scheme. When people hear that, they generally think somebody's getting ripped off. People at the top are making money, people below them are making money, are getting ripped off. They're doing all the hard work while the guy at top works. Does nothing and gets the money. But also when you look at the structure of a pyramid, you have this base, right? And as you go up, it gets a little more concentrated. Until you have, this kind of pinnacle at the top. So when it comes to power and authority, what we're talking about is every level up, the power gets more centralized, the authority gets more centralized, until you get to that top where it's either one individual or maybe a group of individuals who are benefiting from everybody beneath them and using that mechanism, that pyramid, to to enslave the people. Anybody ever seen that? I don't know who the artist is, but there's this really awesome piece of art. There's a couple different ones, but there's one where it's got like, the guy, like the bankers or the dudes in suits like playing chess, because this is all a chessboard to them, and then the people are like underneath it, and the chessboard's like resting on our backs. That's kind of how I see the pyramid, is like all these institutions are there. We're down at the bottom, like, the artist.
No, wait, you said you're against centralized power. How do you feel about centralized welfare?
Centralized, like in the form of governmental welfare, or just well, obviously, I mean, I'm against government in general. So I mean, I'm always going to look for the people solution over government, right? But so yeah, that's kind of how in my mind I see it, is like all these institutions we're about to describe. Underneath that is where we are, like or at least that's what they would like. I think it doesn't have to be that way. So we're going to invert this pyramid, turn it upside down, and start from there. So what I see here, I see big pharma, right? We're going to go through each of these in depth. I'm just going to lay it out for right now. Big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry. Big education, the state education system. The establishment or corporate media. Big agriculture and the biotech industry. The oil industry, what's sometimes known as the oligarchy. Then you take a step up. You've got the military-industrial complex. All the people who participate and profit off of sending nations and people to die in wars. The nonprofit industrial complex, which is a fairly kind of new term. We're going to talk about that. These different groups that are not part of government but yield a lot of power and are able to influence a lot of our world. The prison industrial complex. We'll talk about that. I'll share a little bit of my personal experience of going to prison and what I learned through that. Then you get up and you got the banks, right? Of course, the banks finance everything that we're about to discuss and go through. And then you also have 3 different entities that I think are kind of really the key to a lot of this happening. That would be government, corporations, and then what I'm calling false religion. Now, obviously, we'll get into the details in just a moment, right? And then you take a step up and you're at the top of the pyramid, right? But before you get there, everything that I just described, all those institutions, before you get to the top of the pyramid and whoever's up there or what groups of individuals are up there, there's a really thin line there that I call the belief in authority, which is what underpins all of this. As we go through these examples, you're going to constantly hear me refer to and see how the belief in authority, the blind belief in authority. I'm not just saying if for example, if he's an architect and we're all trying to build a building, we're probably going to lean on him for the architecture, right? There's nothing wrong with giving him that authority because he's taking the time, he's aware of that sort of thing. That doesn't mean I'm going to give him authority over my life and what's up, man? Doesn't mean I'm going to give him authority over my life and allow him to tell me what to do and whatnot. But what I'm talking about is all these institutions, from big pharma to corporations to media to every institution that we're about to cover. The reason they are allowed to exist, the reason they do the things they're doing, is because we give our power away. It's that belief in authority, right? And then you move to the top of the pyramid and you have what I call psychopaths. Throughout history, they've been given different names. They've been called the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the capitalists, the parasite class, the elite, the globalists, the technocrats, the deep state, the shadow government, whatever you want to call them, right? That's who we put at the top of the pyramid. And my goal tonight with this presentation is not to tell you this is who's at the top of the pyramid, okay? There's plenty of other people who've done that research and there's a lot of different views on that. Different people will point from everything from aliens to whatever else you want. That's not my goal tonight. My goal tonight is more to describe what makes up the institutions that make up this pyramid and how we, again, are allowing these things to happen, how we are giving our power away and allowing this whole system to happen. So that's the pyramid of power. You guys ready to dive in?
Yes.
You guys want to check out?
Does everybody have the notes?
Yeah. So let's start with this pyramid of power. We'll start with big pharma. Big pharma, pharmaceutical industry, whatever you want to call them. This includes companies like Pfizer, Merck. I actually found out when I was researching this that Merck is actually currently being sued by 2 former employees turned whistleblowers who said that they were made to lie about the effectiveness of a certain vaccine. That's a lawsuit going on right now. Bayer, however you want to say it, who, on your notes it might say in the process of buying Monsanto. That's already happened. Now they own Monsanto and they're slowly working on deleting the Monsanto name from from our consciousness, because what happened in the last few years, there's been this mass March Against Monsanto movement. They want to get rid of that. Purdue Pharma, GlaxoSmithKline, I mean, the companies go on and on and on. They make pills like Paxil, Lexapro, Adderall, Ritalin, Prozac, Lithium, Xanax, and I mean, there's millions of others out there, right? This is the industry that is, well, basically those companies I just listed there, like for example, Bayer and others, they started out as chemical companies. Like they started out by making weapons of war, making genocidal weapons that were used in both World War II and in other conflicts. Monsanto, the same thing, and now they've gotten themselves involved in health, right? I wouldn't really associate health with the pharmaceutical industry, but that's what the mainstream world will tell you, right? So you have chemical companies involved in violence now responsible for distributing medicine to people. Now this whole industry is built off, as I'm sure you guys know, keeping people sick. It's not about actually getting people to be well and getting people cured or getting people to have a treatment that they don't have to constantly come back and buy the next pill. They want to sell you one pill and then sell you another one to deal with the side effects of the first one. And that's just how they work. One of the guys that, and this should be in your notes, one of the guys that I have been following that is really an important voice in this, his name is Dr. Peter Broze. He is a psychiatrist. He's kind of seen as the rebel psychiatrist because he calls out all the rest of the psychiatrists for their over-reliance on pills. So in the psychiatric industry, it's basically you come in there, if you have some sort of illness or anything, they're just going to be ready to write you a script to hand you one of these pills that is made by these same companies. Dr. Peter Broze has been fighting this for the last 30 years. He wrote a book called Toxic Psychiatry, Why Therapy, Empathy, and Love Must Replace the Drugs, Electroshock, and Biochemical Theories of the New Psychiatry. And he's hated by most of the other psychiatrists because he spends his time calling them out for their bullshit and basically saying, we are not supposed to just write people scripts for every problem they come in. He says that the industry is creating what he says will be an epidemic of brain damage and mental illness over the coming generations because I don't know if you guys have seen any of the numbers, but his books do a great job outlining the statistics. The statistics of kids who are prescribed Adderall and Ritalin and these things at like 5 years old and even, sometimes younger, it's just insane. Now think about what that's going to do to a very young mind, developing mind, and if they stick with it and they stay on these drugs for a long term, like that's literally changing their brain chemistry. And so Dr. Peter Broze believes that in the coming decades we're going to see this mental, this kind of brain damage actually play out. He also sort of controversially thinks that not all mental illnesses or chemical imbalances are real. He thinks that a lot of this has been created by the pharmaceutical industry in order to prescribe people more medicine. He doesn't say that all mental illness doesn't exist. Obviously, there are a lot of real traumas that happen to people. But what he's saying is that these things aren't not necessarily genetic or even physical in origin, that a lot of times, just like many things in our life, there's a deeper root. You might have some trauma from some experience that happened to you as a little kid, and as you get older, you haven't dealt with that. So then you start acting out or you start having different behaviors, and they take you to the doctor, they're going to prescribe you some medicine and just dope you up another way. I know from my own experience that being very young and depressed and suicide attempts and things like that, my parents would constantly take me to these clinics and things where they're trying to get me on pills, and I would always lie to them and just act like I was okay because even though I was really kind of messed up inside, I knew that pills wasn't going to fix me, that it wasn't the answer. And so that's what Dr. Peter Broze talks about. Anything you can find with him, if you look on YouTube or elsewhere, there's podcasts, interviews, etc. It's going to be very informative, but the best thing to do would just be to read his book. And he actually calls the pharmaceutical industry the psychopharmaceutical complex. And in his book he says the following: the psychiatric model of human suffering has caused untold damage to hundreds of millions of victims of involuntary treatment, psychiatric hospitals, drugs, and electroshock. It has also set back civilization by undermining Western traditions of individuality, personal responsibility, and love. It has convinced modern society that emotional suffering is based in so-called biochemical imbalances, when in reality it is rooted in a complex combination of human nature, individual experience, choice-making, and societal influences. So once again, he's saying there's more than just chemical imbalances. There's childhood trauma, which attachment theory talks a lot about. There's just different experiences that we pick up and have in our life, and most of us, I think, we just move through life kind of, something happens to you and you got to go to work the next day, or you got to keep moving on with your life, so you don't necessarily stop. And like we took some time earlier to meditate, maybe you don't have time to, or you feel like you don't have time to sit and reflect on like whatever trauma and stress you're dealing with, and so you just keep going through motion. And so for a lot of people, it's easier to just pop a pill and like, okay, now I feel better. Like I'd rather do that than actually look inside myself and deal with my own emotional muck, right? That's what these people are feeding into. They're preying on our weaknesses and our desire to have a convenient fix for deeper issues that are not easily fixed, that probably take a lifetime. Because I don't care who you are and what we project outwardly via social media and elsewhere, we all have doubts, fears, and insecurities that we carry with us. They may look differently for each of us, and they express themselves differently. Something that affects one of us, you might look at somebody else and be like, they're so badass and awesome, and I can't believe they let that silly thing affect them. But it can be so paralyzing to them, because we're affected differently by different things. Dr. Peter Broze continues, The flawed biological model ignores all the important realities in human life, from the dreadful effects of childhood trauma and adult disappointment. Again, emphasizing that other things affect us, not just, hey, you have a chemical imbalance, take this pill. This is the important stuff. He says, first, we need to weed out the influence of modern biological psychiatry, where it strangles our individual lives and cultural values, and we need to replace it with values such as independence, mutuality, responsibility, and love. As far as I'm concerned, that dude is fighting the same fight as us. He's just focused on his specific industry and trying to fix it from within there. And many of you have heard me talk about my drug abuse and things in the past and going to prison. When I was going through all that, I was taking all kinds of drugs like on a daily basis, and it just tore up my stomach. I had all kinds of issues, and I ignored it for the first couple of years. I got locked up. I tried to get help while I was in prison. They kind of laughed at me and were like, "Cool, get out of here." So I just dealt with this like lower intestine, couldn't use the restroom right problems for years. When I finally got up the time or courage or whatever it is when I got out of prison to go like, okay, I'm gonna go to the doctor and try to figure this out. I go to the doctor. I hadn't been to my childhood doctor since I was 15 or something, and I go there expecting to see my doctor that I had grown up with, and instead I'm met by two very young dudes in lab coats. They may have been doctors. They were in a doctor's office. They were wearing lab coats, but I'm skeptical based on their behavior. But either way, these two gentlemen said they were the doctors I was seeing for that day. And I started to describe them like, I can't use the restroom, man. Like, I'm just having all this kind of stuff going on. These guys listened to me for less than 5 minutes. He's listening. He's like, you know what your problem is? You're stressed out. Hold on one second. And he goes to the next room. And I don't know if there was like a big pharma exec literally sitting in the other room, because that's what it felt like. He goes to the next room, and he's in there for a couple of minutes, comes back, and he hands me a box of Lexapro, which I don't know if they still prescribe Lexapro, but 10 years ago it was like the antidepressant that they were giving to everybody 10, 15 years ago. So he hands me like 5 or 6 boxes of Lexapro. He didn't look at I don't even think he opened up my chart or anything like that. He didn't like even pretend like, okay, let me come check you out. He was just like, start taking these, and once you're done with these, come back and we'll get you on a script. And I was just like, so dumbfounded by the whole thing, like, fuck, like, I know what's going on with me is more than this, like, yeah, maybe I'm stressed out, but that's not what the hell's going on here. And I think I took it for one day. I talked to a buddy of mine who had also been prescribed it and was telling me that it was making him have, like, anger rage fits, and I just threw it away. I was just like, fuck these doctors, and I just dealt with it for another couple of years. It got much worse, and I ended up having to go to the hospital a couple of years later, and I ended up finding out that I had 2 tumors in my lower intestine that these jackoffs wouldn't even, like, pay attention to, because they are just so ready to push their pills on me. And I don't think I'm alone in having those kinds of stories. There's so many people out there who are misprescribed or overprescribed all kinds of things. I mean, really, whole other topic, but when we talk about the opioid crisis, a lot of the doctors, that's why doctors are now going to prison around the country, because they are knowingly prescribing people these medicines more than they need, and in that case, to addicts, to people who are addicted to them. So it's really a dangerous situation. And outside of just programming people to be zombies, the other sort of side effect that I see of this situation is that it disconnects people from nature. So let me explain this to you. When you think about all the different medicines that we have in the world, whether we're talking about over-the-counter stuff to prescription things, say from aspirin to Neosporin and to everything else, right? The vast majority of these have a root in nature, right? So what I mean by that is at some point, some person from the West went to an indigenous community or went to the rainforest and saw, oh my God, look at this. These tribes or these native people are using this plant to treat wounds. They're using this thing for menstrual cramps. They're using this for this. They brought it back to the West, put it in the lab, synthesized it, pulled it out, turned it into a pill, extracted whatever they wanted from it, and then they sell it to us in a cream at the store, right? And it's obviously that's very helpful for modern life. That's helped us, be where we are now. But I think a sort of byproduct of that process is that we get disconnected from the fact that these medicines, because they are medicines, come from the planet. They come from the earth, and I personally think that the earth is a living being that we are just a part of, like as a kind of bigger entity. And my point here is that may seem sort of unimportant or sort of trite, but I think it's a big part of this, is that they're disconnecting us from the source of these medicines by just, we don't necessarily go think about this is coming from the plant whenever you eat this pill. It's kind of a mechanical process. And I think that's done by design. The other aspect of the pharmaceutical industry is the suppression of alternative treatments and potential cures. Now, I'm not saying that everybody out there on YouTube claiming to have the cure for cancer is legitimate. Obviously, there's a lot of hacks out there. But it's kind of interesting when you start to do the research and you find out about certain cancer treatments that happen to be illegal in the United States, and you can't get access to them, or you have to go to some foreign country and spend a lot of money to get access to different things. Have you ever looked up Latriol, B17? I mean, there's cannabis is probably like the most obvious example. I'm still from a state in the dark ages where you'll be thrown in a cage for possessing a plant. And you know, that's the way this industry thrives. As I said earlier, they win by keeping people sick. So in order to do that, they work with their friends in government. They come lobby them, or they come sit down and have a fancy dinner and say, "Hey, you guys see that there's some new medicine out there? This iboga is getting really popular, treating heroin addicts. You think you could put some extra pressure on that and pass some laws or make it more difficult?" Or they'll just push some little guy out of the business, right? This is that revolving door relationship that you're going to hear me emphasize over and over tonight, that every single one of these industries has friends in government, and because of the government's power, they're able to push out competitors, they're able to make things illegal, and they're able to keep cures off the market. And that it's a symbiotic relationship, right? And that keeps us sick, that keeps us coming back. Not to mention the Susan Komen Foundation, the Race for the Cure, and all that bullshit that is just making millions and billions of dollars. And I don't know where the hell it's going, they haven't found anything yet. But yeah, so that's obviously a part of keeping our minds, bodies, and spirits from being truly liberated. And just a kind of side note, for some reason, when these people start talking about alternative treatments and potential cures, sometimes they die in car crashes. It's the weirdest thing. So let's move on to the education system. The education system is, in the truest form, is the propaganda arm of all governments, no matter where you go in the world. We're talking about the United States. We're going to focus on the Western education system and talk a little bit about the origins of that. But no matter where you're at, the state, the government, no matter what part of the world, they use the education system as a way to indoctrinate their people to the message they want, to teach us the version of science that they want, the version of history, the version of health, the version of politics, the very version of how government works. And also, since we're talking about, like, let's say younger kids who are going into state education, it's the place where they set what is acceptable conversation, right? You learn when you're in school. If you say, "Hey guys, have you heard this 9/11 conspiracy?" and your teacher laughs at you and says, "That's bullshit. Don't talk about that. Only crazy people. That's fake news." Whatever. Imagine just the propaganda kids are facing right now with trying to talk truth. I mean, it was already difficult before, but that is where they can really set the foundation for what we accept for the rest of our world. Think about this. If you don't educate yourself after high school, if you don't go to college or even use the internet to educate yourself, then what you know about the world is formed in those years. And so before we go to this, I want you to think about this. When is the last time you had any relationship where you spent 12 to 13 years, if you went to pre-K, 12 to 13 years, 5 days a week, for 8 hours a day, with anyone or anything? Maybe if you've had a job or been there for a long time, but typically that's very rare. And not only that, but at a time in your life when you're very, very influential, where you're able to be, you're very impressionable, you're very much able to be influenced by other adults. Because I know when I was a kid, I generally just thought like, oh, these giant adults, they must know what's going on in the world because I'm so little and I don't know what's happening. And you kind of have this, again, that authority, that belief in authority. Surely this principal, this teacher, this professor knows what they're telling me. Surely they're not just repeating shit they've heard elsewhere. They've actually done the research for themselves. And then, of course, as we become adults, we start to learn. If you choose to educate yourself, you realize that, holy crap, I have to unlearn so many things that were passed on to me. And our parents and friends who may have been good intentioned, if they didn't question things themselves, they just passed on the same BS. And that's how it just keeps going and going and going, and things just pass down. So think about that as we go through this. When is the last time you had a relationship? 12 years, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And how much power that has. So in the United States and most of the Western world, our education system is based on what is known as the Prussian model of education. And Prussia was a nation that was kind of dissolved after World War II, and it became several smaller nations. But prior to World War II, it was very powerful and it was very influential in our world. And they had their education system. They had a compulsory mandatory education system. And the United States and most of the other Western nations decided to adopt it. Because you have to think about this. We're in 2018. Compulsory mandatory education, the kind of system that if you don't put your kid in school by 6 or 7, we're going to come take them from you. That's only been around for about 100 years. Like, it's still fairly new. And when you look at the beginning of how it happened in the United States, well, you might recognize some familiar names. First, what happened was a few different influential people started studying the Prussian education system, and they said, we need to bring this to the United States. So 1900s, early 1900s, 1915, around that time, slavery had only been, ended for about 50 years or so. There was still a lot of country, rural folk out there. People were just starting to move to the cities and started to get university education, right? So along come John D. Rockefeller, Frederick T. Gates, and Daniel Gilman, who formed something called the General Education Board. After they studied the Prussian education system, they said, we want to bring it here because we want to make sure all those former slaves and those poor country folk and the immigrants, that they don't get left behind, right? So let's make sure we have a standardized education system. Everybody has to go so that everybody is on the same level playing ground, right? It'll be for the good of everybody, so at the least, people can spell and can read and write, right? I mean, it sounds like a positive thing. That's the way it was promoted. However, once you start looking into this education system and you study the people's words themselves, you realize that that wasn't a part of their plan at all. So there was a book written in 1919 called The Prussian Elementary Schools. It was written by Thomas Alexander. He's a professor of elementary education at George Peabody College for Teachers. So he was a teacher going to school teaching other teachers. And this is what he wrote in his book called The Prussian Elementary Schools in 1919, so just about 100 years ago. We believe, however, that a careful study of the Prussian school system will convince any unbiased reader that the Prussian citizen cannot be free to do and act for himself, that the Prussian is to a large measure enslaved through the medium of his school, and that his learning, instead of making him his own master, forges the chains by which he is held in servitude, and that the whole scheme of Prussian elementary education is shaped with the express purpose of making 95 out of every 100 citizens subservient to the ruling house and to the state. So this is a teacher who studied that system in 1919, and that's what he found, right? So as I mentioned, three men, Daniel Gilman, Frederick T. Gates, and John D. Rockefeller, they formed the Rockefeller General Education Board. Their whole kind of mission statement was, we're going to promote standardized mandatory education around the country for the good of everybody. And around 1902, they finally got congressional approval, which means that Congress said, okay, you have a charter, we'll give you tax dollars, we'll give you people's money to fund this and to implement the first standardized mandatory education system in the United States. And so as of 1902, they had a goal of promotion of education throughout the United States without distinction to race, sex, or creed, right? So it sounds like something we could all get behind. And as you'll notice through this presentation, there's a lot of things throughout our world and throughout our history that were promoted as they're going to be good for the people, it's for your own good, it's for your own good. And they end up not being that at all. So despite publicly saying they wanted to promote education regardless of race, sex, or creed, this is what what Frederick T. Gates, John D. Rockefeller's partner, wrote to him in private in 1913. This is public record. You can find their personal letters now available on the internet and all of their kind of history out there. This is what Frederick T. Gates says to Rockefeller in 1913, 10 years after they got the charter and started using tax dollars to promote this system. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions will fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we will work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive country folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for great artists, painters, or musicians. Nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, or statesmen. So there's the founders of the General Education Board themselves saying to each other, writing to each other, the true purpose of what they were doing. It was not to raise us up to be the next philosopher king. It was, what it seems, apparently to educate us just enough to go into the working class, to be able to push a button, to punch a clock, and to become another cog in the machine. That was their whole reason for trying to educate the people out there. But I'm coming from this as a journalist and as a researcher. Let's take a look at two people who were more involved in the educational system. One's a teacher and one worked in the U.S. Department of Education. The first man is by the name of John Taylor Gatto. Anybody ever heard of him? Again, look his name up, look his book. I think I put on your sheet his two books, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, and The Underground History of American Education. John Taylor Gatto is a former award-winning school teacher in New York City. By all accounts was like an amazing teacher. The kids loved him. Obviously he was winning awards for his work. But over time he felt stifled. He kept feeling like, okay, I can't teach this. The state was getting more and more involved in education. As I'm sure you guys know, if teachers step outside of the allowable, like this is what's able to be taught, and then say a student says, hey mom, today we learned about that there's people who question 9/11 and maybe we were lied to about it, that teacher's gone, okay? They're not allowed to veer from what the state-approved education system says. And John Taylor Gatto got very sick of that, and he eventually left, and he wrote these books trying to expose it. And his books, he says that this is kind of the thesis of what he found. He says that the school system confuses the students. It presents an incoherent ensemble of information that the children need to memorize to stay in school. It teaches them to accept their class affiliation. It makes them emotionally dependent. It makes them intellectually dependent. It teaches them a kind of self-confidence that requires constant confirmation from experts. And finally, he says that it makes it clear to them that they cannot hide because they are constantly being supervised. And this is one of the things that I graduated from high school in 2003, right after 9/11, so I started seeing all these kind of changes implemented. And I remember the first time because after 9/11 they were doing this all the time, they would be like, all right, random locker search, and they would just like lock everybody in their classrooms and just tear through all your shit. And I remember when me and a couple other kids were like trying to raise some hell about like, hey, you can't go in our lockers, and they just kind of like laughed at us like, as soon as you walk through those doors, you have no rights, and which is true. Like, the state owns the kids. There's even parents now who can't even get to their kids because they're like, no, you're not allowed to have access to your kids till after school, whatever. That is a part of the programming. They want the kids to get used to constantly being supervised, to the schools being militarized, so that by the time they graduate and they get into the real world and they learn that, holy crap, government's spying on me, corporate agencies are spying on me, they're like, oh, it's no big deal. I've been being monitored my whole life. I mean, I'm just got out of 13 years of school where I'm constantly got cameras on me, cops all around me, armed guards, people searching my stuff. That's just how life is, right? It's a part of the programming. In Underground History, John Taylor Gatto says, what I'm trying to describe is that what has happened to our schools was inherent in the original design for a planned economy and a planned society laid down so proudly at the end of the 19th century. Found the same conclusions that I'm bringing to you. Another woman who was involved in the education system, Charlotte Iserbyt, I don't remember how people... Iserbyt, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Her book is called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And she actually has more experience, of course, than I, and John Taylor Gatto is coming from the teacher side. I'm coming as a journalist. She was a senior policy advisor for the Department of Education. So she worked for the U.S. government, specifically in the Department of Education, specifically developing policy for the nation. And she came to similar conclusions. Her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, basically says two things: that these changes have been gradually brought into the American education system through those same institutions that I mentioned. The General Education Board, which by the way is now known as the Rockefeller Foundation, still around. She said the most two important goals of this system were the following. One, to eliminate the influence of a child's parents, and the second, to mold that child into be an obedient follower of the state. That's what she thinks that the whole goal is. And she also points the blame at some of these same institutions. She says it started with the Andrew Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Education and the Rockefeller General Education Board. So once again, starting with these institutions. And we're going to get into that later when I talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, how these institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Andrew Carnegie Foundation, how these sort of nonprofit think tanks, which they just have simple sounding names, you're not thinking about like, oh my God, that's some evil entity. But they have a lot of power and they have a lot of influence to shape our world. So I focus now on the education as far as the education system and how it's used as a propaganda tool. The last thing I want to say about education, and this should be in your notes, is the infiltration of the education system. So we were just talking about kind of K through 12, elementary, junior high, and high school, how that system is designed to mold the minds of the youth. And that was the very purpose in the beginning. It wasn't about raising us up to be philosopher kings, it was about raising us to be obedient followers. For whatever reason, some of you guys, maybe you didn't watch enough TV or you didn't pay attention enough, you end up here talking to people like me, but everybody else is kind of, bought and sold on it. But it's not just the fact that it's a propaganda system. This system itself is infiltrated by intelligence agencies. Last fall, I interviewed a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist by the name of Daniel Golden. You can find this interview on YouTube. He wrote a book called Spy Schools: How the CIA, FBI, and Foreign Intelligence Secretly Exploit America's University. And basically what he found, there's no conspiracy or kind of hidden documents to it. He basically just went through the trouble of doing the research and showing like, hey, there's all these programs where the CIA and the FBI and other intelligence agencies are literally sending their agents, these are agents of the government, going into universities, Harvard, Yale, lots of others, to pose as professors. So there are 20-somethings out there right now paying thousands of dollars thinking they're getting the best education and they're being taught by an agent of the government. Now, do you think that agent of the government is going to be teaching them to think critically, to question that next war, to question that chemical attack, or question that, or they're just going to be regurgitating the same BS? I think it's quite clear what their goal is to do, right? So he goes through study after study and basically showing how the CIA and the FBI have a very open and collaborative relationship with college universities, and that they're using this to their advantage. So again, this is intelligence agency. What is the CIA responsible for? I mean, overthrowing governments, spying on people, mainstream news propaganda, and those are the kind of people that they're sending into American universities and foreign universities. So the education system is not only built from the bottom up to propagandize people, to make them obedient followers, it's also infiltrated with intelligence agents of the U.S. government and other governments. it's a completely, it's all about propaganda. And now back to what I said earlier, 12 years, 5 days, 8 hours a day. That's 12 years, 13 years of your life swallowing their BS, getting their version of health, politics, history, philosophy. Because if you've done any amount of research on your own, you start to realize, like, hey, maybe the timeline of humanity that we've heard isn't necessarily right. Maybe we've been around longer. Maybe there's all these different things that you start to find that you were never taught in school and that they never even brought. They give you this sort of watered-down BS version of history. So I think it's quite clear how that stands in the way of liberating our mind. I think it kind of explains itself. The next part is the establishment media, and these two kind of go hand in hand. I just want to say a couple things on this because I think most people here already kind of understand how bought off and sold the corporate media is. And you probably have heard that 5 corporations control 90% of all media. That's Time Warner, used to be Time Inc. and Warner Brothers. They became one. Disney, of course, Disney owns all the Disney movies. They own Marvel. They own Star Wars. They have immense power to influence pop culture. Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, which is, of course, Fox News and all the other affiliates that they own. Bertelsmann, which is an international company based in Germany, and Viacom. Viacom owns like CBS and tons of others. So those 5 corporations control 90% of all print, film, TV, digital media, even the internet. The thing about this is, before the internet came along, we had, back in the day, like you had the 1 radio station, and you had the 2 TV stations, right? And then, oh wow, we got basic cable, there's 100 different stations of all kinds of crap, right? And then the internet came out and you had choice. You don't have to go to CNN.com, you don't have to go to NewYorkTimes.com, you can go to the anti-media, you can go watch your favorite YouTuber, you can do, it allowed for this new flood of diversity of opinions and thoughts and research that never happened before in our history. But even with the internet, this same control still exists. There's a lot of new media out there that is being promoted and especially marketed towards the youth, the millennial generation, that is owned by these same people. I would say Vice News is in this category. Vice News started out as like a small magazine that, you can find reasonable reports on Vice, but a couple of years ago, pretty much once they started having Joe Biden touring their facilities, and then the head of Vice, Shane Smith, sat down with Obama for an hour and didn't even ask him any legitimate question. Once that happened, it became quite clear, okay, this is just some more establishment BS. But if you watch any of their reports, what they do is they get some hip, cool-looking young dude to walk around and follow the camera and talk to, and it's just this, it's not the guy in a suit on TV, right? So it speaks to a younger audience. But it's owned by HBO, it's owned by, you just follow it all the way back up to the top, and you're going to find these same people. There's a lot of websites out there that are marketed that way. They're like bright and colorful, and you're not going to get like your grandmother to go there. They're marketed to the youth. But again, they're owned by the same people. So even with the new media, you still have to be suspect of what they're doing. The other thing I want to mention is this fake news meme. This is one of the more important, it's all important, but one of the more important things that relates to me personally that I've been telling everybody around the country, because I'm not sure everybody really understands how dire the situation is. After Donald Trump got elected, the fake news memes started to spread everywhere, right? Everybody was like, oh, this happened because of fake news, because people were spreading fake news stories, and because Facebook didn't do anything about this, and Twitter didn't do anything, and YouTube, and how come the government hasn't done anything about this, right? All of a sudden, everybody's talking about how can we stop the spread of fake news. And over the last 2 years, we've seen what they've done. So what is their way to do something? Well, first thing that happened was there was several lists that went around that were circulating around the internet. One of them was made by a Harvard professor, and it said, these are all fake websites or untrustable, unreputable, and she had a list of websites, and some of them were legitimately fake news, like say Before It's News or IO9 or Your Newswire, some of these really like actual trash websites that just say things like, today the Queen says she's a lizard, and you go there and it's like a video about something else. It's just, it's actual BS, right? So they listed those websites alongside Activist Post, the anti-media, all of the different independent media that we've been building for the last 5 to 10 years. Every single website I write for was listed on these sites, right? And we saw the effect nearly immediately. So I put out an article, one of my friends shares it, one of their friends comes and says, I just saw that on those fake news lists. This is fake, I'm not gonna watch this. And then Facebook says, if you see a fake link, just report it as fake news and we'll get rid of it, right? So that's been going on, all these different things. This week, YouTube announced $24 million to invest in fighting fake news. Last week, Facebook announced that they're going to start something called Facebook Watch, where they're literally funding news now. There's going to be your CNN Minute with Anderson Cooper, brought to you by Facebook. They're working with all these news organizations. This is the future. And this fake news meme, though, the true purpose of it was an attack on independent media and independent thought in general, though. They used this meme, they spread it all over the place, and it played multiple roles. It was attacking the independent media, but it also was promoting division. Because think about this, like I can go up to a Trump supporter, right, and say, hey, have you seen this new crazy thing? Like Trump just dropped this bomb. That's fake news. That's Democratic propaganda, whatever. Then I go to a Hillary supporter or somebody on the left and say, hey, have you seen this stuff? That's just some Russian propaganda, fake news. So both sides can just call each other fake news, get further entrenched in their sides, and confirm their biases. More division, it's all a part of this scheme, right? But the biggest and I think scariest part of this is that independent media is literally hanging on by a thread right now. Just since I've started this tour, when I was telling this, it's gotten worse. But in the last month, Ben Swan, who some of you may know is a journalist, he shut down his website. I'm one of his writers. On June 1st, they announced to us, sorry guys, no more original reporting for the time being. We don't have the funding. Anti-media ended original reporting as of June 1st. Just this last week I got told by activist posts they can't afford to pay writers anymore. Like literally every single independent media website is in the process of either shutting down or scrambling for some solution, because when we got labeled fake news, they started dropping traffic to our pages, which means people aren't going to our website, so people aren't seeing ads. And not that we really like the ad system anyways, but that means we're not getting revenue. That means writers can't be paid. That means editors can't be paid. Because what happened, Facebook 2008, YouTube 2009, all the, they're around that time. Some of us started Facebook pages, we started YouTube channels, and next thing we know, our memes are going viral, our stories are going viral. So some people, the more kind of business savvy, said, hey, you know what? Instead of just the Facebook page, let's turn this anti-media page into a website. Now that we have money coming in, let's hire an editor. Let's hire a team of writers. And we turn these into legitimate outlets where for years we were getting millions and tens of millions of views, surpassing the mainstream. You guys have seen it happen. All of the March Against Monsanto, the global war marches against Syria, all these things that we've done and that many of you have participated in were able to happen because of the free-flowing information on social media. That is no longer possible because of this fake news shit. They literally have dropped all of our traffic 90% or more. There's a page that I work with called The Mind Unleashed. We have 9 million followers. We're struggling to get 100 likes out of those 9 million followers because nobody sees our pages anymore. Pages are being purged. YouTube channels are being just randomly taken down and demonetized. So my point is, of all my activist friends and journalist friends, this is kind of a hot topic right now. We're all like, what do we do? I have friends calling me hey, I think I'm going to have to go get a day job after 10 years, after dedicating my life to writing and spreading information. So not only does it affect us personally, but think about this. Right now there's a huge push going on for war with Syria, war with Iran. This has been ongoing, as you guys know. But there's less and less alternative viewpoints to counter that. And if they continue this trend, there will be no more independent media. And the only people talking will be the corporate media saying, yes, we need to go to war. And there might be a couple of YouTube channels here and there, but that's what we're dealing with right now. I just want you guys to be fully aware of that. And that is done by design. So if you have a favorite journalist or activist, or you or yourself one, support each other, because I would be surprised if these websites are around by the end of the year, to be quite frank. It's pretty hard right now. The only reason I'm able to survive right now is because of my partnership with Smart Cash, and I have info there, and I've just been working with them because, like I said, just last week before we started the tour, activist posts paid me for my last articles, and sorry, this is it, we can pay you based on views. And back in the day, that was cool. We can get a lot of views, but now when there's no views coming in, that means I might get paid $5 a month or something, So I don't know what I would do without doing this stuff. I feel like I would probably do it for free anyways, because most of us started doing this for free, not because we were getting paid, right? And I would still do it. I would find a way, but it's definitely made it a lot more difficult. And the system understands that, and they know that we're struggling to survive. So I just wanted to mention that. The other part of the media is, the infiltration of intelligence agencies. Just like I was talking about with the education system. Who here has heard of Operation Mockingbird or Project Mockingbird, some phrase along that term? Okay. If you look that up, and if you look on the mainstream channels, they'll lead you to the Wikipedia page and they'll say this is fake news, it's a conspiracy, it never actually existed. But the fact of the matter is this. There existed a program, and it probably still exists, I'm pretty positive this is what the fake news thing is, that existed 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was exposed in 1976 by a congressional hearing called the Church Committee, led by Frank Church. He was a congressman at the time, who was tasked with investigating the CIA. In the 70s, for those who don't know, in the 70s, the CIA was exposed for all kinds of shit. Overthrowing governments, having a heart attack gun, there was so much information came out of there. COINTELPRO, which was them infiltrating activist groups. This specifically, what people call Operation Mockingbird, is sort of the catch-all term for CIA intelligence agencies infiltrating the media. And the only reason we know about this is because, and you can find this clip on YouTube, if you just search Operation Mockingbird, Church Committee, thing like that, you'll find a clip where it shows one of the CIA members, he's on the hot seat, and some of the congressional members are asking him, did the CIA at any point have their agents working for American news outlets. And he says, I think we should take this to a private session. He asked him one more time, like very clearly, he's like, did the CIA at any point have their agents posing as journalists and publishing stories? And he once again says, we need to take this to a private session. That was the only thing the public has ever got to see about it. There was a report from Church Committee that found this. This is the conclusion of the Church Committee in 1976. So we're talking 50 years ago, this is what we knew. 50 years ago, they said, the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence public opinion through the use of covert propaganda. The CIA has direct access to a large number of newspapers, periodicals, press services, news agencies, radio and TV stations, commercial book publishers, and foreign media outlets. That was 1976. As far as the domestic media, the report says approximately 50 of the CIA's assets are American journalists. 50 of the CIA's assets, that means like their agents or informants, were American journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations. More than a dozen United States news organizations and commercial publishing houses formerly provided cover for CIA agents abroad. What that means is maybe the CIA wanted to go spy on Russia, right? So they go to a publishing house that has they have a headquarters in Russia, and they say, hey, we're going to put one of our agents in there, and he's going to pose as an employee and kind of do some spying. But as the report said, some of these organizations were unaware that they provided this cover. So they sent one of their agents to go apply for a job, get this job, go sent to some other foreign nation, posing as a journalist or something along those lines, while he's actually spying. Not only were they spying on other people, though, but they were literally trying to influence public opinion by writing fake news stories. The CIA is the originator of the original fake news. It's coming from the government, not from those of us who are actually trying to spread truth. And as I said, in the House Intelligence Committee in 1975, the CIA officials were questioned on TV about this, and the video's out there for everybody to see. But whatever they said in that private session, we'll never know. Probably not. We probably will never know what really happened. But the thing is, the CBS president at that time, he openly admitted. He said, yes, we work with the CIA. He sort of didn't think it was a controversial thing. He was like, the CIA gives us intelligence. They give us lots of good information. Now, what you have to understand as a journalist, our job is to develop sources, right? So say I want to know what's coming up in my city. For example, in Houston, right? I have friends who are on city council. So if there's some crazy bill coming through, they would give me a call or an email and say, hey, you need to see this. Get your people there. They're going to vote on this day. Everybody needs to come in there and try to stop this, right? Or maybe you develop law enforcement sources where a police officer might privately leak you something and say, hey, you need to see what's going on here, right? That's what you do. You develop sources. If you want to know what's going on in the hospital, you need to get friends with somebody in the hospital. So if some crazy body comes through there, they can tell you, hey, something just came through. I would come look at this. So some people develop sources within governments. They develop, they work with politicians who might leak them information too. And it can be helpful, but it's also very dangerous. This is why the New York Times, Washington Post, a lot of the deadstream corporate media, they rely on anonymous sources. You see a lot of their stories that says, according to an anonymous official within the government, blah, 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 blah. And most people just swallow it up because they trust the New York Times. Like if I was to say, hey, according to some anonymous somebody, like this is what's going to happen, like, nobody would trust me. And also I feel like as a digital journalist, if I tell you something that if I quote somebody as saying something, I'm going to have a video record of it or an audio record so everybody can see. I'm not just going to ask you to trust me blindly, which is what the corporate media does. But some journalists will do that. They will develop sources within, say, the CIA and elsewhere. And that's a very dangerous game to play because a lot of times it's difficult to discern, are they giving you this information because they want it out? Because a lot of times governments will do that. They will release, scary or dangerous information that they'll act like in the press, like, oh, this is a big controversy, but they wanted the people to know. They're always playing a game. It's always about propaganda, right? So once you start playing that game, it can be very difficult to discern, are they giving you actual information or are they leading you somewhere because they know you're going to feed it to the public? That's just something to think about. But this didn't just happen in the 70s, and as I said, it's probably still ongoing. We know as recently as 2015 it was happening with the FBI. There's actually a lawsuit going on right now because an FBI agent, at least one that we know of, same thing, he went in, got hired by the Associated Press, and became a journalist, and he wrote several news stories that were, this Associated Press is a news wire, so they just put out the stories and they're picked up by local news stations, they're picked up by New York Times. So this dude wrote fake news stories working for the government, and they got picked up and spread all over the place. Eventually he got caught, and now the FBI is being sued by the Associated Press and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. That lawsuit is still ongoing. So that's just to let you know this. I'm not just talking about something that was happening 50 years ago. And really, I think we'd be stupid to think when the government says, okay, you caught us, we'll stop now. Like, okay. If you believe that, then you probably believe that they stopped spying with emails and all that good stuff. So that's the control of the corporate media, the mainstream media, right? But the internet, is, as I said earlier, is also compromised. Not just in the ways that I was talking about earlier with Vice and that sort of thing, but literal infiltration of social media to guide public opinion, because that's what this is about. The reason we know this, the reason we know that they're influencing social media is because of Edward Snowden. I mean, it should be obvious, but the reason we have the documentation is because of Edward Snowden. When he started leaking his documents in 2013, one of them was about two different agencies. The Air Force, there's an agency within the Air Force, and within the British spy agency, the GCHQ, they have these elite units that basically, it's a room full of computers with some guys sitting at the computers. Imagine this, you got 10 computers, 10 guys sitting at computers. Each man at the computer is controlling software that allows him to control up to 10 fake profiles. This was in 2011. It's probably much more by now. But as of 2011, this software allowed one individual to sit at a computer and to control 10 fake social media profiles. And these are social media profiles with, you know, histories and pictures, and for all intents and purposes, you would think this is a real person. Why would they want to do that? Why would they want to have, you know, 10 people with 10 fake profiles? That's 100 fake people. What is the purpose of that? To influence public opinion. Because we are each influenced by each other. You know, we might like to think that we're individuals and this and that, but we are influenced by each other, especially on the internet. You might go to a video to watch that video, but you're going to read the comments, and if half the people are like, oh, this is fake, this is bullshit, you might not even take the time to actually watch it. You might decide, I got more important things to do. Or maybe it's a controversial video, trying to ask you to question 9/11 or question the latest chemical tax, right? And you're watching and you're like, whoa, this is pretty trippy, man. Like, I don't know, this... maybe I am being lied to. And then you look at the comments and other people are like, oh, this is bullshit, fake news, like, oh, I wouldn't even trust this. And it kind of makes you, or maybe they say, anybody who believes this is a crazy conspiracy theorist. And then you stop and you're like, whoa, I don't want to be called that. I don't want to be, like, isolated. And, you know, and it affects the way we see the world. It affects the way we communicate with each other. These Snowden documents show specifically that the GCHQ and their unit, for those who care about the facts, it's called the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, or JTRIG. And this document, which is a very long and boring name that I won't read, says the following, that these units are to manipulate public opinion, understand human thinking and behavior, and encourage conformity. This is, I think, one of the most important parts. They want to encourage conformity. These are intelligence agencies in the British and American government creating fake profiles on the internet to encourage conformity. They want us to think the same and dress the same and act the same and be the same. They want us to be afraid to color outside of the lines, to step out of the herd, and to think for ourselves. They want us, when you say, hey, maybe I don't believe that, guys, maybe I'm not going to follow the rest of you into that, you know, slaughterhouse. They want us to be afraid to be that, to be ourselves, and maybe to even use these fake profiles to make fun of other people who do that, right? So, according to one of the 2011 documents, these are their tactics. This is how they do their job. They upload YouTube videos containing persuasive communications. They start Facebook groups and Twitter accounts, create fake online personalities and supporters to, quote, discredit, promote distrust, dissuade, deter, delay, or disrupt. So let me say that part again. They start fake Facebook groups and Twitter accounts. They create fake online personalities and supporters. Personalities and supporters. So maybe you're listening to a YouTube channel that never shows who it is and it's just a voice. That could be a fake person with fake supporters to, quote, discredit, promote distrust, dissuade, deter, delay, and disrupt. They want us to distrust each other. They want to deter us from actually taking real-world action. They want to delay us from our goals. They want to disrupt our activities, and they want to dissuade us from pursuing these goals. Once again, this is how they operate. They infiltrate and influence public opinion by actually controlling the corporate media, and if that doesn't work, well, then they'll just get online and use social media to try to discredit anybody who questions things and make those who question feel uncomfortable and feel like, wow, man, I don't want to be labeled that crazy guy at the party next time I go out because I was posting something on Facebook. And I've seen it happen where people will privately message me, people who I never had any idea they were following my work because they never liked anything, they never commented, never shared anything because they're afraid. They're afraid people are going to look at them weird. And they privately message me and say, I've been following you for 5 years. I know exactly what's going on, but they'll never speak out publicly. They're afraid to lose their jobs. Personally, I think we're past that point of being quiet. It's past the time of being polite. It's time for everybody who's awake and know what's going on to step up in some way, whatever that means. I'm not saying we all need to be like doing what I'm doing necessarily, but having a conversation, like being willing to say, hey, you know what, guys, actually, I think that's bullshit. I don't buy that same line. Let me share some information with you. And to have those difficult conversations, because they can be difficult. It can be difficult to tell people, hey, maybe I don't believe what you guys all believe. You know, it can be hard to be that one person,